Story 1: The Neighbor. In 2016, I rented an apartment in Austin. It was the last unit available, priced below average, in a neighborhood that felt almost too quiet. The kind of deal no one offers without a reason. I signed the contract in an office that smelled of old materials. The manager handed me the keys in a hurry, like she was getting rid of something. She didn't ask why I was there alone. She didn't explain why no one stayed in that apartment. The place wasn't big. White walls, no marks from previous tenants. No pictures, no personal touches. It felt like everything there was waiting for the next mistake. The first few weeks, routine left no space for discomfort. Study, work, come home, repeat. The unease came before any clear reason. That unit felt detached from the rest of the building, as if the hallway outside my door led somewhere I wasn't meant to find. The neighbor's presence didn't come with an introduction. She was already there. My first memory of her is just a slight movement in the corner of my eye. Thin frame, hollow eyes, an expressionless face appearing at the door next to mine, without a single sound. She didn't really smile. Her face held the gesture, but her eyes were always somewhere else. The following days were the same. We passed each other in the hallway, and even without words, I could feel her studying me. There was no curiosity, only calculation, as if I were just another item on a list she reviewed in her mind. She started leaving small signs that she knew my routine. A lasagna left at my door. An unfamiliar object placed near my lock. Little gestures out of place and time. That's when I realized it wasn't about getting closer. It was about taking over. The discomfort was already there before a single word was spoken. But it needed something more to become impossible to ignore. I went to the spiritual center out of boredom, or maybe curiosity. I expected to leave with some silly story. Instead, I walked out carrying a certainty I tried to ignore for days. In the middle of the session, the medium stopped. The air grew heavier, and even those who felt nothing noticed the emptiness that suddenly filled the room. He didn't look at anyone in particular. He simply said there was something here. A woman. Not alive, not dead. Out of place. The comment was never repeated. No one asked for clarification. Everyone went back to the session as if that sentence hadn't just been dropped in the middle of the room. On the way home, the building felt bigger, the doors farther apart, and my key felt heavier, like it was dragging me somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. It was the first time I thought about leaving, but I still didn't understand why. After that night, I started noticing the building. Before, there were familiar faces. Someone from 202, the woman by the front door, people going up and down the stairs with groceries. Ordinary people just passing through their days. Now, the hallway was always empty. It wasn't just silent, it was absent. Too many closed doors. No lights in the windows. No sounds of life from anywhere. The only movement came from her. Madeline. She appeared without sound, always where I least expected. She started bringing small things. A plate of food, mail that wasn't mine, a trinket I'd never seen before. Slowly, my routine changed. Casual conversations with neighbors stopped. The few doors that still opened would shut quickly when I passed. No one looked at me anymore, and when they did, they looked away fast, like it was already too late. The following weeks dissolved into repetition. The routine dragged until the day the face from my dream appeared for real. At the new gym, he was there. Not as a stranger, but like someone who already knew me. The receptionist. Same look, same exact posture I tried to forget. I tried to ignore it, but the recognition came before logic. The exchanges started small. A nod, a random comment. Then came the inevitable connection. One night, a storm forced us into conversation. I accepted a ride home without thinking. The connection was too fast. as if the dream had been a rehearsal. What I didn't notice was everything else moving around us, like it was being watched. A week later, he was gone. I stopped seeing him. His uniform sat empty at the desk. The other staff looked hollow, detached, as if he'd never existed, or as if he'd been removed. Inside my apartment, the space changed. Before, the walls felt distant, the ceiling too high. Now, everything pressed in, like the place was breathing slowly, waiting. Madeline was still there, always hovering, always close. The offerings increased, food left without warning, objects I never saw being brought in. Some things felt like they were mine, but I couldn't remember ever owning them. Then I saw it clearly. The isolation wasn't a consequence. It was a method. The missing voices, the averted eyes, the deserted halls, part of a calculated process. She knew exactly when to appear and when to vanish. The building wasn't my refuge anymore. It was hers. Discomfort became routine. The feeling of being followed, even when I was alone. The weight of the air, even with no one near. There was no doubt left. This wasn't friendship. It was a siege. That night, the apartment stopped being just a physical space. It became a boundary. The noise started late, when everything was too quiet to ignore. Objects dragged, sharp thuds, as if someone was rearranging things nearby. I froze. I didn't want to know if it came from the wall or from inside. When the silence returned, I smelled it before I saw her. Alcohol, sweat, and something sweet, too sweet to be natural. She walked in. No knock, no word. She looked different. Her eyes deeper, her body trembling. Her voice came out slow, dragging, as if it wasn't hers at all. What followed was quick. Accusations thrown into the air, words spat like commands. She said I was just like the others, that I had chosen the wrong side, that everyone in that building would die. The outburst lasted only minutes, but the damage stayed. I shoved Madeline out the door, but her scent clung to the walls, along with something heavier, something that stayed. From that moment, the apartment was no longer mine. The exhaustion hit my body before it reached my mind. Sleep became impossible. Hunger disappeared. The whistling started on the third night. Thin, constant, coming from the living room. It wasn't the kind of sound you hear, it was the kind you feel. Her presence grew stronger after the invasion. Not physically, but in everything. In the shadows cutting through rooms, in the weight that dragged the air down. That's when I went back to the spiritual center. No questions, no explanations. They came, stopped at the door, as if they couldn't step inside. One of them glanced toward her apartment and muttered something no one repeated. The entity revealed itself immediately. It wasn't human, and it wasn't just hers. It pointed next door and said what I already knew. She gave you up, and the work is almost finished. What came next was just survival. The group didn't enter. They said the space needed cleansing first to push away what was there, and what was still coming. I stayed sitting, motionless, as they moved through the apartment, filling corners I no longer dared to reach. When they finished, one of them approached me. There was no relief in his voice, no promise that it would be okay. Only the cold report of what they'd found. She started in the first month. Used whatever she could, objects, strands of hair, anything within reach. Every offering strengthened the bond. Every ritual left a trail. And now it wasn't just her anymore. The entire building carried the weight of unpaid debts. They told me about the hospital, about the patient, about the case that got buried. They told me what no one else had the courage to say. She owed too much, and there was no one left to collect, only what stayed behind. 2 months later, I went back to my hometown, dropped out of college, left everything. Some things don't deserve to be finished. The building stayed behind, but the sound didn't. Sometimes, in the dark, the whistling returns, thin, constant, coming from nowhere. They told me some marks never leave, that some presences don't fade. They just drag themselves toward the next empty space they find. Story 2. The stepmother who abused us. Before she came along, we used to run through the house and the backyard. Ben and I were like two little wild pups, laughing loudly, making up games. Our mother's death was a terrible event. I don't remember much, only the emptiness she left behind, swallowing everything. Dad tried. He really did. But it wasn't enough. The weight of raising two small kids alone seemed to crush him. That's when she appeared. The new wife. First, it seemed good. Dad gave in way too fast, like a man desperately needing someone to put the house and his life back in order. With her came new routines, her way of imposing silence and control without ever raising her voice. The tea started almost like a kind gesture, something to calm us down, to help us sleep, a ritual. The smell of the tea was awful, strong, bitter, clinging to our skin. It wasn't chamomile. It never was. We drank quietly. The cup was always full, steam rising as she watched us sip until the last drop. There was no room to refuse. Dad watched from a distance, too tired to question anything. He'd say she was good for us, that he was grateful someone was taking care of us. But the exhaustion grew. Sleep hit like an impossible weight. We'd wake up wrecked, our bodies heavy, eyelids stuck together. Ben started dragging himself around the house, eyes empty. His bony knees shook. The boy who could never sit still became a shadow. She watched every change with a small, satisfied smile, like she was seeing exactly the effect she wanted. The routine was unbreakable. The tea, the silence, the sleep. Over time, I learned to fake it. I'd take the cup to the bathroom, pour it down the drain, rinse my mouth to cover the taste that didn't even exist anymore. I knew she noticed, but she didn't seem to care. Ben, he was the one she really wanted. He drank every last drop. Dad never saw it. Or maybe he didn't want to. Ben started wasting away fast. His legs couldn't hold him up anymore. The light in his eyes faded. His skin lost its color. He wasn't the same boy who used to run beside me. Now he spent his days curled up on the couch, silent, breathing deeply like he was holding on to whatever air he had left. The house smelled different. Everything reeked of her tea, and of him, the stench of sickness crawling through the rooms. Dad saw it. He'd say it was just a phase, that Ben was always more sensitive, that the new school was too much for him. He kept repeating that she took care of us like no one else could. He seemed to believe it so hard that any word against her felt like betrayal. I stopped drinking the tea. I think she knew. She never said a word. She knew I was just there to watch what she was doing to him. There was something in the way she looked at Ben. It wasn't just contempt or indifference. It was like she was waiting for the exact moment, like someone measuring the time it takes for a plant to grow, or for a life to end. As if he was part of a process she already knew by heart. Like she knew exactly how far he could endure. My grandma noticed before anyone else. Or maybe she was the only one who actually cared. She came during one of those scheduled visits, carrying grocery bags and a scent of life that didn't exist in that house anymore. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Ben. They stayed there too long. She saw what my dad pretended not to see. Her silence that day felt heavier than any scream. She moved through the house like she was sniffing out something rotten. She noticed the jars lined up in the kitchen, the dried leaves hanging everywhere like decoration. When she left, she didn't look at me. She didn't look at Ben. She came back days later, colder, harder. That's when I knew she wasn't visiting anymore. She came looking for answers. She stood in front of the kitchen cabinets for too long, just watching. When no one was looking, she jotted down names, touched jars, felt textures. She didn't say a word, but her face hardened. My grandma understood before I did. This wasn't meant to heal. It was meant to kill slowly. And no one there except her dared to say it out loud. The next time she came back, she was ready. She didn't announce herself. Walked right in, eyes cold, her whole body tense. She didn't bring any bags this time. Just her gaze, locked on Ben, too weak to lift his head. His skin the color of old paper. She waited for the right moment. When my dad left and the stepmother locked herself in the bedroom, my grandma went straight to the kitchen. She didn't hesitate. She knew exactly what to look for. Opened cabinets, searched shelves, found jars with strange names and some with no name at all. She reached all the way to the back of the highest shelf. And there it was, a small, dark bottle. Belladonna, the name stamped on a faded label. It wasn't a sedative. It wasn't tea. It was poison, the kind that kills slowly, from the inside out. My grandma held that bottle like it was a death sentence. Her hands didn't shake. She didn't need anything else to understand what was happening in that house. In that moment, her face changed, as if whatever hope she had left died right there. She came back 2 days later. No warning, no words. The car running, the door open. I knew instantly. She walked in, picked Ben up in her arms. Too light for a boy his age, too weak to fight back. I followed. The stepmother was on the porch. She watched everything in silence. Didn't move a muscle. Her face calm, almost satisfied. Dad wasn't there. Maybe he knew. Maybe he stayed away because deep down, he realized he'd chosen the wrong side. The gate slammed shut behind us. That sharp sound echoed in my head. In the car, my grandma drove fast. Never looked back. Her eyes locked on the road, like stopping wasn't an option. Like it was the only way to save what little was left. Ben was either asleep or unconscious. Hard to tell. He just breathed weak and shallow, like part of him was already gone. I turned around one last time. She was still there, standing on the porch, staring. That same small smile, one that didn't look like defeat. My grandma never told my dad what she found in that kitchen. She took us and never came back. Ben survived, but he was never the same. His body healed, but his mind, it stayed trapped back there. He spent nights awake, silent, staring at the ceiling like he was waiting for something. I knew exactly what it was. Dad tried to see us. He really did. But Grandma never allowed it. She did everything she could, protected us until her last breath. And when she died, she took everything she knew with her, everything she never said out loud. Now, I can't touch a cup of tea. I don't eat anything unless I see it being made. That distrust, it became part of me. Story 3, My Grandmother. The sky was overcast on the day of my grandmother's funeral. It didn't rain, but the air carried that heavy humidity that comes right before a storm. Hardly anyone showed up. Mostly old neighbors, people who barely knew her. They did what was expected, paid their respects, and left quickly, as if they were in a rush to forget. The ceremony was simple. Light wood casket, flowers already starting to wilt. No music. No one really cried. The silence felt heavier than the loss itself. I stayed until the very end, waiting for what? I'm not sure. I only stood up when the gravediggers threw the first shovelful of dirt. On my way out, I noticed a woman I didn't recognize. Thin, hunched, her skin so pale and thin it almost looked transparent. She didn't speak to anyone. Before disappearing, she walked close enough for me to catch a scent. Like old, forgotten fabric, something left in the back of a closet. She never looked at me. She didn't have to. Something about her stayed with me. That night, alone in my grandmother's house, I started going through her drawers. The house was small, the walls stained dark from years of grime. Yellowed papers, photos of people I didn't know, worthless objects. It was in the back of a cabinet that I found the wooden box. Simple, heavy, smelling strongly of cedar. When I opened it, I found a piece of cloth carefully folded. A black veil, thick silk, stained by time. In one corner, a dark mark. Old blood or just dirt, it was impossible to tell. Beneath it, there was a thick piece of paper, folded in half, handwritten. The words were short, firm, leaving no room for doubt. The firstborn dies. Always. Don't try to stop it. Don't try to break it. I read it over and over until the words lost all meaning. There was no explanation, just a cold, dry warning. Like it was simply a fact of nature. For a moment, I thought it was a cruel joke. But there was nothing funny about it. Not even strange, really. Just heavy. A growing discomfort pressing against my chest. I spent the rest of the night digging through my memory. Family stories, those tales you grow up hearing but never really pay attention to. I started remembering forgotten names, relatives who barely existed, babies born and dead before turning 3 months old, miscarriages, accidents. Always the first child. The next morning, I took the paper to my mother. I didn't say a word, just handed it to her. She read it quickly, but it took her a while to lift her eyes. Her face hardened. She didn't ask where I'd found it. She just took a deep breath and started talking, like she'd always known this moment would come. She told me about the son she lost, a brother I never knew existed. Died during childbirth, never made it out of the hospital. She told me about her sister, who lost 3 babies before one finally survived. She told me about her own mother, my grandmother, who was actually the second child. The first was born dead, and no one ever spoke about it. These weren't stories. They were facts. Always the firstborn, always dead. In the days that followed, I tried to forget. But my mind kept circling back. I started mentally listing every family story, every silence that now made sense. It wasn't some old wives' tale. It was a pattern. Every woman in our family had lost her first child. Always the first. My mother started talking. The brother I never knew existed was stillborn. She never mentioned his name, if he was ever given one. Then came me, the second, the only one who survived. My Aunt Helena lost her first early in the pregnancy. They said it was a miscarriage. No one ever talked about it again. Then came the second, but he didn't make it past 3 months, sudden pneumonia. The third was born dead. Only the fourth survived, my youngest cousin, raised as if he were the only child. My grandmother was the second daughter. The first was born but died before she turned 2 months old. A fever no one could explain. To this day, no one visits that grave. I went looking through documents, old records. Every generation repeated the same cycle. Loss, silence, and life moving on as if nothing ever happened. Sometimes it was a miscarriage, sometimes a disease, other times bizarre accidents. But they never escaped. At the bottom of the veils box, there was a list of crossed-out names. All firstborns. All dead. I stared at that list for hours. I didn't tell anyone. There was no point. Knowing wouldn't change what was already written. I went back to the city, trying to bury all of it along with the rest of the family already gone. I convinced myself it was just an old story, someone else's burden, something that didn't belong to me. The kind of secret that dies with whoever wrote it. Time passed. Routine helped push it all into the background. Then I met Sarah. She was beautiful, full of life, the complete opposite of everything my family carried. We got married quickly. I never told her anything about my family. Not about the veil, not about the note, not about the crossed-out names. Felt too insane to say out loud. And somehow, part of me believed that if no one knew, the story would end with me. When Sarah told me she was pregnant, the ground felt like it gave out beneath me. But I swallowed hard, smiled, hugged her. I didn't show a thing. I made a point to plan every little detail, like that could keep me in control. The following months were normal doctor's visits, ultrasounds, shopping for baby things. No complications. For a while, I started to believe that maybe it was all just coincidence. Silly fear over something that no longer existed. Noah was born surrounded by every bit of care money could buy. Strong, healthy, no issues. He weighed just over 3 kilos and immediately filled the room with his loud cries, like he was making sure everyone knew he was alive. Sarah cried. The doctors praised how smooth the delivery was. The nurses said he was a strong baby, no signs of any problems. I stayed silent, unsure of what I was feeling. Deep down, I waited for something to go wrong. But it didn't. Days turned into weeks, and Noah kept growing. Every checkup confirmed he was perfectly healthy. No sign of the shadow I carried in silence. Sarah embraced motherhood naturally. Everything seemed easy for her. At first, I just watched, waiting for the worst that never came. Slowly, I allowed myself to relax. I started to believe maybe all of that really was in the past. I even thought the veil, the note, the list, maybe it was just inherited fear from people who lived surrounded by death and misery. Noah smiled, waved his arms, reacted to my touch. Sarah talked about the future school, vacations, his first words. And I believed her. For the first time, I truly believed. The night Noah died, there was no sign anything was wrong. Sarah went to bed early, exhausted. Our routine was always the same. Feeding, bath, the quiet of the night. I checked the crib before going to bed. Noah was sleeping peacefully, fists closed against his chest, his face calm. Everything was fine. I went back to the living room and let the exhaustion take over. I don't know how long I sat there, the TV on mute, staring at nothing. When I went back upstairs, the whole house felt too quiet. Noah was still in the crib. Nothing was out of place, his little body lying exactly as before. But his face was lifeless. His skin was too pale, his lips a shade of blue no one ever forgets. I touched his chest, searched for any sign of breathing. There was nothing. I called out for Sarah, but my voice barely came out. When she got upstairs, she knew before even getting close. The hospital confirmed what I already knew. They called it sudden infant death syndrome. No explanation, no cause. Just a cold name for something no one can truly explain. We buried Noah 2 days later. Hardly anyone came. Sarah didn't say a word. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say. They called it a tragedy. I called it the price. The cycle closed exactly as it was written. I'm sure it was my family's curse. Years passed. Life moved forward the way it does after a funeral. Slow, empty. Sarah and I drifted apart, like two people who both knew there was nothing left to hold on to. The veil is still with me. I've never been able to get rid of it. I don't know if it's out of fear or because, deep down, I know it's not over. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, remembering Noah's face. Too calm, too still. And now I understand what no one ever dared to say out loud. Some debts never end. They pass from one to the next. And when the time comes, there's no choice. Story 4, Melody. It all started when I moved to Maple Grove. Small town, people stuck in time. I was expecting boredom. Definitely not what came next. Melody showed up during my first week at school. I don't know where she came from. Nobody does. She was just there, staring at me like she already knew me. She latched onto me way too fast. The kind of person who smiles all the time, but whose eyes never follow. At first, it just felt like a forced friendship. But she always knew where I was. She'd show up out of nowhere. If I was in the cafeteria, there was Melody. Library, bathroom, empty hallways. She was always there. What creeped me out was that no one seemed to think it was weird. It was like, to them, Melody had always been there. I let it happen. That feeling of being noticed by someone like her, it's too good to question. And she knew it. Within a month, I couldn't even remember what life was like before her. Melody took up space, spoke about me like she owned my story. The other girls stared, but no one ever said anything. The worst part was her gaze. It looked hungry. The signs came fast, but I ignored them. Melody copied everything I did. My hair, my clothes, even the way I walked. If I got a new notebook, the next day she'd show up with the same one. Every day she looked more like me, like she didn't want to be my friend. She wanted to be me. Then I started hearing unfinished stories. Rumors that trailed off before anyone dared finish them. They said that last year another girl disappeared, and before that, she was always hanging around with Melody. The police never found the body. My mom started having nightmares. She dreamed of me, surrounded by people dressed in red, staring at me like I was already dead. She knew nothing about Melody, but she kept telling me to be careful. I laughed it off, pretending it was just random. But something had already started to rot inside me. The necklace showed up one afternoon after school. Melody placed it in my hand like it had always belonged to her. A dark, metallic pendant, too heavy for its size. In the center, a red, opaque stone, like dried blood. I didn't ask where it came from. She just said it suited me, and I took it. That night I couldn't sleep. I dreamed of people surrounding me, hooded, whispering. In the middle of the circle, the necklace glowed. I woke up drenched in sweat, thin scratches scattered across my arms and legs. In the days that followed, my body started failing. I woke up exhausted, my head heavy, my face pale. The mirror showed me someone I didn't recognize. Melody, on the other hand, seemed to bloom. Her skin more vibrant, her eyes brighter, and the more I faded, the more she thrived. The necklace was never warm, never cold. Felt like it didn't belong to this world. Yet I wore it. I couldn't take it off. Every time I tried, my chest ached, like something was pulling me back. No one noticed what was happening. No one but Melody. She watched as every piece of me vanished, and she seemed to enjoy it. I found the truth digging through old school records, a forgotten list buried in the archives. Names of girls from different years. All of them had vanished without a trace. And in every old photo, there she was, Melody, always in the background, always smiling. They called it the Crimson Circle, a group no one dared admit existed, but everyone seemed to fear. The victims never knew they were marked. The necklace was the seal. After that, no girl ever made it past 3 months. The girl from last year had one just like it. No one ever saw her again. I realized it too late. My body couldn't take it anymore. I woke up with my chest tight, my eyes sunken, my face collapsing into itself. It felt like something was draining the very life out of me. Melody followed me. Even when she wasn't there, I felt her, like a shadow glued to my skin. Sometimes, I'd turn around quickly and swear I saw her watching me from the doorway, silent. I tore my room apart, desperate to find proof that I still existed. Photos, journals, old messages. That's when I noticed Melody never appeared clearly in any of the pictures. Just a blur in the background, a smudge out of focus. Where she should have been, there was nothing but empty space, as if the world itself refused to capture her. That's when I understood. Melody wasn't just a girl. She was the circle, a cycle that repeated generation after generation. A lure meant to pull others in. The necklace felt heavier, like it was part of my body now. The stone pulsed, breathing. In the mirror, I couldn't even recognize myself anymore. On the last night, I did what had to be done. I ripped the necklace off with everything I had. My skin burned, blistered, but I didn't stop. I threw it into the fireplace and watched until the metal twisted and collapsed. When the fire died, Melody was gone. No goodbye, no trace. No one missed her. At school, no one remembered her. Not the teachers, not the students. It was like she had never existed. I searched for her name in the records. Nothing. No Melody on any list, no trace. Just emptiness. But the feeling stayed. Months passed. Life moved on. But I was never the same. People said it was all in my head. That Melody was never real. Maybe that was easier to believe. But sometimes, the weight comes back. I wake up in the middle of the night, the room ice cold, the smell of burnt metal still in the air, and the emptiness in my chest. That kind of emptiness no one sees, but it eats you alive from the inside out.